this week we are tackling the good old employee handbook. Why do you need one? What should it include? And what are the best practices? So, Summer, what? First of all, what's an employee handbook?
Oh gosh. Well, um, I kind of chuckle simply because I can't tell you how many conversations I have about this on a regular basis. And it's totally okay. We recognize that businesses are at different levels of their growth. But I think discovering that there are many small businesses that just aren't even familiar with the basics and or why they're necessary told me this would be a great topic to discuss. And if you know what an employee handbook is, great. We hope that you'll stick around because we are going to share some nugget um, might be new to you. But an employee handbook is an absolutely essential part of your HR toolkit. And in short, it is overview of all of your company rules that you're expecting your team members to follow. So in most cases, they aren't full policies. It's just an overview. And I've seen employee handbooks that are very short and concise, and they leave a lot of room for the company to have flexibility with how they administer their rules per se. And then I've also seen them, 75 plus pages. So that's probably the shortest overview that I can do of an employee handbook. But as you can imagine, not having one of these can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, because it's dangerous because, and we talked about this somewhat in an earlier episode. When the government says that something's important, you have a duty to treat it important and make sure that you understand what it means for your business. So imagine having a company and not abiding by rules that you don't know exist. What is it saying? Ignorance is no excuse for the law. So you have to make sure that you are aware of the rules in your jurisdiction. And if you have folks across multiple locations, you have to make sure you know what's going on in those locations too, because you are liable and responsible for those locations. So yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, why do companies need one? It's really to set, manage, and hold employees accountable to expectations. And internally, from an HR standpoint, it serves as our go-to for any technical questions. So if a team member says, say, for example, um, how many vacation days do I accrue after I've been here for 5 years? Well, if a company has a different rate than what they earned upon hire, then it should be documented in there. That's just one example. There's so many different topics that are addressed similar to that in an employee handbook. And again, you flip through it, you find the table of contents by topic, and you go to that section. And again, it's to set expectations with your team because they should be reviewing and signing and acknowledging this upon hire, referring them back to it over the course of their employment. And then it's also that internal tool for the HR team and leaders when employees ask questions that we're all on the same page. But if that wasn't enough reason for why you should need one, Joey, did you know that the employee handbook is one of the top 5 most requested documents in HR lawsuits?
I believe it. I believe it, and I'd imagine it's probably like number one because I think about any time that we've been asked to by client, like, "Hey, we're doing something, and we're not sure if this is the right call to make, whether it be a termination or a PIP, or usually it's something where you start getting those feelers, like maybe legal should be involved." And the first thing that I'll say is, "All right, well, what does your handbook say?" Because 9 times out of 10, and this is not legal advice, so quick disclaimer out there, whenever you do get in front of whenever we have gotten in front of a government, whether it's for like an unemployment hearing or whatever the case may be, they say, okay, well, what does your policy say? What what contract, quote unquote, did you have with your employee? What expectations did that employee have? What did they know that they were responsible for? What did you know that you were responsible for? And so the handbook kind of it's supposed to cover all of those things, but failing to have it can get you in a lot of trouble.
It absolutely can, and most of the time when I've referred to an employee handbook, besides just for some, like, general, like, reference of, like, a technical question, it has been in regards to team members who are about to be documented or terminated for violating a company policy. And oftentimes those are, behavioral standards and expectations. And so, to your point, if you're going to separate a team member for, say, falsifying their time records, and they've signed the handbook, and in the handbook, they're acknowledging that they understand that what the definition of time card falsification is, and that it would constitute. Then when it comes time to separate them, then you have the basis to do it because that expectation was set and documented up front. So then bringing it full circle, right? If it did result in an unemployment claim or some other, formal legal complaint, then like everything's there. It's laid out, right? The employee knew, they acknowledged it. They broke the rule. They lost their job. They knew that up front.
Yeah, and we see this in one place that we see it a lot is when you're hiring someone and they may be in that, like, you call it a probationary period, but your employee or your new hire may not know that's a probationary period. And something's not working, something's not clicking, and you want to decide what to do next, right? You may want to go ahead and terminate the person, but if it wasn't communicated to them that it's a probationary period, they're subject to evaluation, yada, 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 then you can start to get cold feet about making that call, which ultimately turns into, we'll keep them around, which ultimately turns into, well, we can't fire them now, which ultimately turns into they've destroyed your work culture. So,
Right, right.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
I appreciate you sharing that story because I see so much value in employee handbooks. I should say amazing employee handbooks. And the reason I make that comment is because I'm sure you've seen it. There's a handful of just like download and go templates that are advertised for next to nothing. And I would say you should never utilize an employee handbook template without any sort of expert review, preferably legal review, because if this is the document that's going to help or hinder your organization when it's pulled into a lawsuit, you don't want to find out that there's problematic language in it at that time. Some of the best practices that I'd suggest, in addition to having that expert review, is for multi state employers, and that is build your main handbook around your headquarters or where you have the largest employees represented, and then add in specific language underneath those sections where there may be a variable for different states. So, for example, sick time in your state, there may be one policy, but maybe you have employees in another state where there's a different sick time requirement. So, if you have a different policy for that, if you haven't adopted the most stringent as a whole, then you just want to list where there are differences for those states that you work in. And then two more items. And Joe, if you have some, that would be cool to hear as well. I definitely recommend employee handbook item. make sure your team members have time to review it and ask questions. And to note that the employee handbook is also an amazing place to put at the very end a lot of those compliance notices and requirements that companies have the obligation to the hands of their team members, because it's really difficult for them to say they didn't get it if they signed off on the employee handbook and it's in there.
Yep. Yep. That's the main thing I was going to say is that make sure that you give people a place to sign, and then that you actually get their signature and that you store it someplace, because that's what will come back to haunt you later, is if you don't get that signature, because then an employee might say, "Oh, well, I didn't see it." And you could say, "Well, we sent it in an email." And they might say, "Oh, well, I never opened it. I never saw it." Um, so whether it's a physical signature or electronic signature, make sure that you get it signed.
Joey, before we go, what are your thoughts on how frequently companies should be revisiting their handbooks for making updates?
I think handbooks should undergo a hard refresh every 2 years, and you should be looking at policy every 6 months, because laws change at the state, federal, and regional level all the time. I mean, think about the laws that change just because of COVID. Um, and think of some of the laws that change just because there's a new administration in government, whatever that looks like, federal, state, local. Um, so I'd say every 6 months you should be taking a look at, hey, is there anything significant that we need to be modifying based on the law, and also based on our company culture and what we ascribe to. And then the other piece of that is, like every 2 years, just making sure that you refresh it, and that you even use that as a training opportunity for folks to get to know their handbook, get to know their company a little better.